Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the ENSign podcast. Today's topic is forensics. How companies can use forensics to safeguard their business. Theft, fraud, and other kinds of white-collar crime have always been part of the concerns of the business owner in Ghana and in many other countries. Sometimes the concern is about outsiders breaching the systems of the company and using deceit or concealment to obtain money or some other kind of advantage. Other times, it is a company's own employees manipulating the systems they are supposed to protect and using deceit or concealment to steal from the company. Smart money says that it is no longer effective, or it is not always effective or prudent to rely on in-house or police investigations in order to catch the perpetrators and to recover your losses. It might be far better to engage a team of professionals with backgrounds in information technology, policing, accounting, finance, prosecution, and law in general to uncover the schemes, identify the culprits, produce a report, which is probably the strongest piece of evidence of what has happened, and to perhaps even testify in courts and tribunals, all to help you to punish the culprits and recover your losses. Listeners, this is the territory of forensics. But there is more to forensics than just plain Sherlock Holmes. And that's why we have brought our two guests into the hot seat today. Our guests are Stephen Powell and Joseph Konedu. Stephen Powell is a partner at ENS and doubles as the head of the firm's forensics practice. He works out of Cape Town. He is a lawyer, a financial crime investigator, and a white-collar crime prosecutor. Stephen's experience as a forensics practitioner includes work in anti-corruption compliance, anti-fraud, and anti-bribery risk assessment. He often accepts invitations to speak at leading conferences on white-collar crime, fraud, and corruption in Africa and much of the world. And he has an obvious passion for solving complex white-collar crime and recovering losses for his clients. Joseph Konedu is a partner at ENS, where he works in the commercial dispute resolution practice. He works out of Accra. He is a lawyer with 11 years post-qualifying experience. He has experience in conducting or assisting with workplace investigations involving dishonesty, corruption, money laundering, and theft on the part of employees. Welcome to the ENSign podcast, Stephen and Joseph.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Good to
you,
speak to
David.
listeners. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. So I guess we'll just jump right into it. So, Stephen, forensics invokes the idea of crime scenes. I can picture CSI, New York or Miami or some other Hollywood movies or documentaries on serial killers and all. But the title of this podcast suggests that it applies as much in business. In that context, what is forensics?
Forensics is not blood scenes, toxicology, firearms, ballistics, etc. As you say, this is not CSI, but it can be equally exciting because what we follow is a financial trail. We follow the money, and following that money trail often involves unraveling a myriad of complex financial transactions. And I equate this often to a jigsaw puzzle and finding the pieces of evidence and putting the story together. Thanks, David.
Interesting. And Joseph, what would be your professional take on forensics in Ghana? Is it still pretty much a CSI thing, or do you see much of it on the ground?
So following Stephen's lead, it is not what you see on TV. It follows the same trajectory as what Stephen just explained, and it's usually more about chasing the money to find the culprit. So instead of chasing blood, usually in our part, we'll be looking at the money to find the offender.
Okay, Joseph, but I'm asking that, do you see much of it at play in Ghana? Is it used as much as in maybe South Africa or in Europe and other parts of the world?
I think comparatively, we don't see much of it in Ghana. I think it's a very new field as far as Ghana is concerned. And when you hear the stories from other jurisdictions, you can see that it's being utilized to very good effect in other jurisdictions. But unfortunately, in Ghana, it appears that it is now taking roots, and a lot of businesses are not taking advantage of this.
Great. So, Stephen, back to you. Of course, situations might vary, but what kind of professionals would you typically or often put on your forensics team to investigate white-collar crime or some corruption activities in a company?
David, that's a very good question, and it's a very strong multidisciplinary mix of professionals. So we have forensic lawyers like myself, forensic accountants, forensic investigators with investigation background, policing type of background, and then coupled to that, and very importantly, in addition, we have digital forensic experts. So we are able to image computers, we're able to extract mailboxes of suspects, and even image cell phone data and collect the social media discussions. And it's the combination of those skills that makes private forensics so powerful, because we're able to unleash the expertise of those different disciplines and get them to work together and collaborate to put these jigsaw puzzles together and find the evidence. Thank you.
Interesting. I'm almost tempted, Stephen, to jump ahead of myself and ask a very basic question, because you talked about the digital forensics. Maybe I should. If employees of a company commit some kind of crime involving dishonesty and delete the records from the company's computer systems, can these digital and imaging experts basically retrieve what has been deleted? Because it seems to happen quite a bit, as I think Joseph will say later.
Yeah, absolutely, David. We've got tools and technology to recover deleted information. And that's one of the first places we look when we do a forensic investigation. And then individuals often think that they delete in an email when they delete it off their laptop computer. They don't realize that there is a backup on the server through mail servers like Mimecast, where we can recover what has been deleted as well. And the same applies to mobile phones. There's a lot of information that we are able to retrieve, and some of the technology we use is very similar to the technology used by institutions like the FBI in the United States. The tools are sophisticated, but we have to have sophisticated tools to stay ahead of the crooks, because they are also becoming a lot more sophisticated and they also use the technology. But there is always a trail, and people may think that they can cover up the trail, but we'll find the different links. And sometimes that trail is in metadata on emails and documents that are transmitted. So there's a lot that the technology helps us to recover and unravel. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Stephen. Joseph, which brings me to you for the next question. In a Ghana-specific sense, what kinds of situations do you often come across in your work which you think might benefit from forensics investigations to resolve?
So, David, I'll give a number of examples that we've seen in our practice. But before I give the examples, maybe I can premise my answer with this. So employment relationships are supposed to be built on trust, but ironically, it is because of the trust employers have in employees that we have seen usually lead to some of the examples I'm about to give. And the second point I would make before going to the examples is that in literally all the instances that we've come across, the wrongdoing was uncovered accidentally. So sometimes you find a whistleblower who, because the person is being treated poorly, would say something, it will trigger an investigation, and then the company will realize that there's a lot of rot. Or maybe there's some routine audit in some department, and before you realize, when you dig deeper, you notice that there's been a lot of wrongdoing going on in your business. And with that premise, I would go straight into some of the examples, and I've grouped them into three. One is procurement breaches. So we've seen in the past that in some companies, very senior executives or employees would sometimes set up parallel businesses within the company. And so while the company is engaging what it believes to be third parties to provide goods and services to the company, unknown to them, they are actually engaging their own employees who have set up these companies with their family members and friends, and they will be fleecing the company dry. And we've seen that a lot. The second example I classified as breach of trust. This is where you find the people who are supposed to be the gatekeepers actually being the ones who are creating the situation that causes the company to lose money. I'll give an example of the finance director of a company in one of the incidents we were involved in, who was manipulating the company's payment systems to basically steal money, take money from customers and delete the record of their indebtedness from the system, and also in some instances actually paying himself salaries several times over. The third example I will give is what I consider to be just simply stealing. So we've seen situations where employees, even when companies have set up systems, electronic systems to track exit of products and the like, you see employees create a syndicate within the business where they would manipulate the electronic system so it no longer works, and the company would then be forced to use manual. And then you would have loads and loads of products leave the business without it going through any kind of system, and the company has no means of tracking. And David, in all these instances that I've given, we've seen huge sums of companies lose huge sums of money in the millions. So it's a very serious occurrence, and it's actually more common than people think it is.
Thanks, Joseph. So, Stephen, back to you. In these Ghana-specific cases which Joseph has outlined, which I suspect are not unique to Ghana, and you meet them in your work all over the continent. Assuming that we have these instances of conflict of interest by employees, corruption, wiping of data in order to perpetrate invoicing fraud on the employer and all, I guess my question is a practical question. How can forensics help? When you deploy to the company, what are some of the steps you take to catch the crooks?
Absolutely. So the first step that we do is we do a lot of business intelligence on the suspect, and we gather intelligence on whatever businesses, entities, interests are linked to the individual. We also do lifestyle audits on individuals, looking at properties, vehicles, credit profiles. And once we put the picture together, it is usually quite telling, and that in itself gives you a lot of evidence, useful evidence, if someone is living beyond their means, if they have bought properties without financing, it's unbonded properties, and the amounts are paid for in cash, or the bond is beyond the means of the individual to service. So that's the stuff that we do behind the scenes, and that is a lot of desktop analysis. What we then do is we do the more overt investigation techniques, And that is, before we interview the suspect, we try grab the mailbox of the suspect and see who the parties are communicating with, and if there's a procurement fraud and there's potential kickbacks coming back from a supplier to that employee, then we will look at the communications between the employee and that entity. But often they're not going to talk on email, and so when we do the interviews, we often image the mobile telephone of the suspect, and that's where we find a lot of valuable evidence. We find on things like WhatsApp, there are discussions around, dude, did you get that information I sent you? Dude, when are you going to pay the money you promised me for this information? Those are the types of messages we find. And when we put that together, coupled to the document review, we'll be pulling the invoices. And obviously, if there is a manipulation of payment information, that will be recorded on the system. There is usually an audit trail. So and the example that Joseph gave earlier, where you had the FD diverting payments, we're going to be able to pull the audit trail of when the bank account of a particular supplier was changed to the personal or salary bank account of that FD. And we will also be able to determine what payments have gone that way. And the other tool that we use is when we've got sufficient evidence, we register a criminal complaint with the authorities, and then we get the police to subpoena the bank records of the particular suspect. And when they get those records, it's going to show us not just the payment that our client might have known about or suspected, it'll give us a history of other payments that often we find client was unaware of, and that where a person or company thinks that a senior accounting official has only started stealing in the last few months, when we subpoena the accounts, it sometimes goes back a lot longer, and there are many more transactions than we realize. So those are all some of the techniques. The digital forensic technology is also important. We've got sophisticated technology to do the searches, to find documents on the laptop of the individual. So if, for example, the FD was creating fake invoices or tampering with invoices to create the impression of a legitimate invoice that has been doctored, we will find that on the computer. And we use tools like Relativity, which is one of the strong e-discovery tools with built-in AI technology to help us refine the searches. On a recent investigation we did in the medical fraternity, we looked at 6 million documents, and we managed to narrow that down to about 28,000 documents that needed extra
6 million.
attention. 6 million documents, yeah.
Ooh.
It runs into terabytes of data, because you've got to understand, if you're looking at a complex financial fraud where a person has stolen millions, it's going to mean a lot of transactions, a lot of documents, and sometimes the suspects use multiple bank accounts as well. So it can be quick, it can take months to investigate, but with the tools and the technology and the expertise, we usually get to the bottom of what has happened. And then last thing that I want to share, David, is when we have all the evidence and we've got a money trail that leads to the suspect's bank account or the suspect's wife's bank account, they often use their partners or their spouses, then we go into confrontation mode. And we confront them and we say to them, so we can see we have a number of transactions we need to discuss with you. And then we walk them through. We can see on the 14th of January, there was a payment of $500,000 to your account. And then we see on the 28th of January, there was another $500,000. Please explain why you received these payments. And if there isn't an innocent explanation, it's very hard for an individual to lie, because the money has left a trail and we followed that trail. So what also happens in a lot of these cases, we get suspects to confess and to own up. And once individuals confess and admit the criminal conduct, it speeds up, one, the disciplinary process for an employer, and two, a criminal justice process, which often goes into some form of guilty plea, because it's hard for people to contest and dispute the evidence that we have gathered. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Stephen. Fascinating stuff. So what you've just been discussing is where an incident of dishonesty has in fact taken place, and some of the steps you take in nabbing the perpetrators. But what about looking into the future, or what about fraud and corruption controls, even where there is no history of actual fraud? I guess I'm asking that, does forensics deal with doing a stress test for systems of companies to make sure that they are working or will work to prevent corruption and all that?
Absolutely, David. You're touching on a very, very important part of forensics' job. Boards of companies are continuously asking management, how can you proactively prevent the frauds before we get burnt? And so management are under pressure to come up with ways to address the frauds before they happen. And the one is through strong controls, and we do what we call an anti-fraud and anti-corruption risk assessment, where we look at the control environment, we look at what the company has put into place, we look at the prior fraud history of the company as well, and then we determine if there are gaps, if there are vulnerabilities. We look at policies. You need to have gift policies. You need to have declaration of interest policies to make sure that employees understand that they can't just set up companies in conflict of interest with their roles. You also have to make sure that you have trained your people on what the key fraud risks are and what the fraud risk indicators are, so that people are more adept at identifying the frauds at an early stage. And then, you've got to make sure people are aware of the symptoms of fraud, so where you've got people with a lot of financial pressure working in finance teams, that's a red flag. Where you have people frequenting casinos or having some form of addiction, whether it's gambling, alcohol, or drugs, that is a fraud risk indicator. And then there are other areas where an individual cannot provide reports or information on simple transactions. That's another fraud risk indicator. So having training on those different fraud risk indicators is also very, very important. And that risk assessment, we also often refer to it as a gap analysis, because we identify where there are weaknesses, loopholes in your controls that may be exploited. So, for example, on the diversion of payments that Joseph was speaking about with the financial director, you've got to make sure that the controls around changing a vendor's bank details on the system is strictly controlled. If individuals in the finance team have ready access to that type of information, then it's very easy for them to divert payments. The other important control is to make sure that people understand the importance of segregation of duties and password protection, because if staff are sharing passwords with each other, it's very easy for a crook to gain access to the system to perform illicit transactions. So these are all the types of things that are checked for vulnerability when you do the fraud risk assessment. And these fraud risk assessments are critically important. It's actually a global requirement for anti-corruption purposes to make sure that you do these assessments, to make sure that you minimize the vulnerabilities and limit the possibility of companies paying bribes. So it is a good exercise and a healthy exercise. And we often also refer to these as a health check. So it's like putting the company, you spoke about stress tests, David, and that's a good analogy as well. And we can do this at any time for any company, even when they haven't experienced a fraud. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Stephen. I guess this leads nicely to the next question, which is about, let's say you have completed a forensics job, whether it's a crime investigation or a health check, as you call the risk assessment, and produced a report for the client. Is this the point where you say bye-bye and on to the next job? Or is there anything you, as a forensics practitioner, you can typically do to help the company further?
Absolutely, David. What we have to do is make sure that we give the client sufficient recommendations. So if there's been a procurement fraud and a payment has been diverted, we've got to make sure that we leave the client with that gap closed. So If there was a lack of segregation of duty, we highlight that to the client. If there's an additional control that needs to be put in place with additional signatories that have to be added before an individual employee can change a supplier's bank account, we make all of those different recommendations. And then the last thing, which is very important, is when companies experience a fraud, and there's so much cyber fraud at the moment where people click on malicious links and then they allow outsiders to gain access to our systems, to infiltrate our mailboxes, and then to commit fraud at will. If those are the types of vulnerabilities that are exploited, what is so important to all companies out there is that they have to make sure that they learn from the bad experiences, that they train people to recognize the symptoms of cyber fraud when there is a malicious URL attached to a document. You know, what happens with the fraudsters on cyber fraud is they will send individuals SMSs, WhatsApp communications, and emails where they notify of a return from the receiver of revenue, a nice tax return. People are so tempted to click on the link to see how much money am I getting back from the receiver, and how much money is it that I'm going to suddenly have in my accounts. And it's tempting for people, and they make it look like it's coming from the receiver of revenue, but in fact it's a syndicate. And if you click on that link, you'll be giving the syndicate access to your information. And if you click on the link thinking that you now can access the receiver's website, you actually engage in on the criminal's website, and as soon as you leave that website, they will be logging onto your system, changing your bank account, and diverting, if there is a refund or tax credit due, they're able to divert that payment to themselves. So when I talk about the learnings, what is so important is to have training sessions with staff to say, this was the exposure, this is how we can prevent it going forward. Please be careful about what you share on social media. Please be careful about what links you open up. When you get an email from a source that you don't recognize and you get an email with a benefit that you aren't expecting, please be suspicious and report these to IT rather than clicking on the link. You know, those are the types of messages that happen with the training. But as I said, you know, we're there to help the client to make sure that they manage the risk. And sometimes we go back 12 months later to go and check if our client has experienced a significant vulnerability and they've lost a lot of money to fraud. They then fix it. We do another assessment in a year's time to see, you know, what is the current state of play? Are they still exposed? Is there still vulnerabilities? Those are all the types of tests that companies need to really think about and make sure that they monitor the risk. And it's a continuously evolving risk. So we recommend to clients that they should do a risk assessment at least once a year, sometimes every second year, to make sure that they're ahead of the game, because fraudsters are evolving all of the time. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Stephen. I find the idea of the annual or half-yearly risk assessments very, very interesting. And I think it should interest all companies in Ghana who are remotely suspicious that they are victims of fraud, whether by their employees or in collaboration with outsiders. I have one more question, which is a slightly naughty question, but I'll ask it anyway, Stephen. I don't know how it works in other countries, but we know that a sizable part of the forensics work in Ghana and in some other African countries is done by accounting firms, which makes sense because when we're talking about the professionals you would typically find in a forensics team, you mentioned forensic accountants. So I guess my question is, why should a company consider engaging a law firm to do a forensics investigation for it rather than, say, an accounting firm?
There are a number of reasons, David, and I'm glad you asked that question because it's an important question. The big differences between a law firm investigating fraud and corruption as opposed to the audit firms is that lawyers are, by the nature of their skills, in a position to provide legal advice. So when we see a fraud, we can call it a fraud. And if you've read any accountant's report, they steer clear of arriving at a conclusion as to whether fraud has taken place. And often the accountants will end a report saying, you need to consult your lawyers. And so what we do is we do the forensic accounting, and we have in-house accountants, but we are able to provide the legal advice. And the legal advice is critically important when it comes to compliance, because anti-corruption has global and local requirements, and you need a lawyer to give you advice to make sure that you are on the right side of regulatory compliance and that you don't end up as a company on the wrong side of an enforcement action by a regulator for not having the right compliance programs in place. So that ties into another important consideration. And that consideration is legal privilege, professional legal privilege, because when you get a report from a law firm and the work is done in contemplation of litigation or the provision of legal advice to our clients, we will be protected by legal privilege. The reports by an audit firm, unless they are routed through a lawyer, are not going to be automatically privileged. So that's an important distinction. But I think what and I think I'm also in a good position to answer the question, because before joining ENS, I was a partner at Deloitte for 6 years. And I do know that the auditors are constrained. They can't express a legal opinion when they do the forensic investigation. We can call a fraud, but more than that, the lawyers can recover money as well. So we don't just investigate, we try and provide a total solution to our clients. And the total solution means calling a fraud when we find it, registering a criminal case, being prepared to testify as an expert witness in a criminal prosecution, and then helping the client to seize whatever assets, whatever funds have been misappropriated. We help with demand letters and civil action to recover those losses. And when we don't have civil recovery, we often work with the state, with asset forfeiture units across the continent in order to recover. And we do get a lot of money back, because remember, I spoke earlier about how many of the suspects that we deal with confess. And that's the other difference between the approach from the law firms versus the audit firms. Auditors don't like confrontation, and they typically will not engage with the suspect. So you leave the investigation with a crucial element lacking, and that is the engagement with the suspect. When we engage with the suspect, it has value because it provides evidence. Whether the suspect confesses, if the suspect confesses, it'll make the whole disciplinary and criminal justice process a lot quicker. But what also happens is, if a suspect lies to you and denies culpability, they're pinning themselves down to a version, and later on, if we can show the facts are different to what the suspect has conveyed in an interview, that is useful evidence in a court of law, and it often leads to the conviction of the accused. So these are all benefits from the legal approach, which I think my best answer is that it is a one-stop solution, getting money back, getting the evidence, and making sure that the matters sustain disciplinary or criminal prosecution. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Stephen. Joseph, any final words on the one-stop solution Stephen just talked about in the Ghana perspective?
Yes. So when Stephen was speaking and mentioned how accountants would, in their practice, require lawyers because of their own limitations, it reminded me of one of the instances where we had to assist in an investigation because the client had engaged in an accounting firm, and the accounting firm could not provide legal advice on the information that they were recovering. And then secondly, because some of the discoveries by the accounting firm had regulatory implications, the communication of those findings directly from the accounting firm to the client would not have been protected by legal privilege. And so ultimately, the client had to structure that particular piece of work in such a manner that we became the entity that's engaging the accounting firm, so that the accounting firm provides investigations while we lead the entire advisory process. So like Stephen said, usually when you use a law firm, which has the kind of capabilities that Stephen has spoken about, you get a one-stop shop where, you know, from just an accounting perspective, from an investigations perspective, and then from a legal perspective, you are fully covered. Another quick point I wanted to make on that point is that usually if the wrongdoers are internal, so employees, sometimes if the outcome of the investigation process would be maybe disciplinary proceedings, or you may want to then terminate the employment of the employees, those who are culpable. And in such situations, you need a lawyer to guide you to navigate the disciplinary process very well. Because sometimes if you bundle the investigations and you do not follow internal documentation and even the legal framework in the country, you may find information, but you will struggle to use that information, or subsequently the employee can challenge any step you take because you did not abide by the law during the process of investigation. So I totally agree with Stephen that it's very, very, very helpful if you have lawyers right from the start assisting with the process.
Thanks, Joseph. Listeners, a company always wants to keep down its cost of doing business as compared with its revenue. There is always the risk that dishonest and corrupt acts by outsiders, by employees, or a syndicate of outsiders and employees can cause the company to lose money or stock or other assets. This also adds unintended or perhaps even unknown costs to the cost of doing business. Using forensics to catch problems like these, punish culprits, and to design your system of checks and balances seems like a no-brainer to me. What about you, listeners? Stephen and Joseph, thank you so very much for joining us on this ENSign podcast episode.
Thank you, David.
Thank you to David.
Thank you.
And
Hopefully
I've
we will have the
enjoyed
pleasure
this,
of
learned a lot.
Oh,
Thank you,
yes.
and
Stephen
thank
is
you,
an
listeners.
amazing man. Thank you. And thank you to listeners, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.